Hello everyone, and welcome to Dynamics Con and my presentation on 4 real-world problems solved with Power Automate. I'd like to thank the Dynamics community for voting me in to give this presentation today. I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to more in the future. My name is Herb Johnson, and I'm a Dynamics 365 Senior Consultant for Stone Ridge Software. I've been working with Microsoft CRM products since 2010. Prior to that, I was a mainframe programmer for many years. I enjoy working with Dynamics 365 for Sales, Power Automate, and the rest of the Power Platform. Feel free to put your comments, questions in the chat pane. I'll be here at the very end of the session to respond to your questions live. In today's session, I will share the Power Automates and highlight Power Automate actions that are used. Here we have the 4 user requirements that I will be basing our Power Automates on today. As a member of the accounting team on a monthly basis, I need customer invoices to be created for services that have not been completed, so I don't have to create them manually. The next one, as a sales manager, I need to see the monthly opportunity revenue splits based on project duration, so I can better plan and forecast for the future. The next one, as a support manager, on Friday, I need to receive an email for each support person listing their current cases, so I can manage the team's workload better. And the last one, as a sales manager, I need accurate account addresses with counties so I can better align territories with salespeople. In our first user requirement, we're going to take advantage of a few actions within Power Automate. The first one is scheduling. So we're going to be scheduling this Power Automate to run on a monthly basis. Once it triggers, we're going to get data from the services custom entity in Dataverse. Once we have that data, we're going to be grouping it by account. Now, unfortunately, the list action does not support aggregation at this time. So we're going to take advantage of Power Automate's functionality to make this happen. And then we're going to be creating an invoice header in Business Central, which includes invoice lines for the product. And then we'll finish off by notifying the accounting team when the Power Automate completes. So the first action is scheduled. So this is scheduled to be triggered on the 3rd day each month at 2 a.m. So you can see in this action, we have the interval of 1 and a frequency of month. And the start time here is March 3rd at 6:30 a.m. So you can see that kind of gets us the start time and it gets established there. Once it is triggered, it's going to get a list of services that have been performed in Dataverse. Now, services is a custom entity that we are accessing here. So in this action, which is a list action, we go after that table of services and we filter the rows to make sure we have the active records and also the status that the service is completed. And we check the date to make sure that it has been completed. We also look at the payment terms to make sure that we're not pulling in any records that have payment terms that are prepaid or on demand. And we also check to make sure that the BC item GUID custom field is not null. This is there to make sure that we don't recreate any invoices that are already created. And finally, in the sort by, you'll see that we have the account value field there. So this way we're getting all the accounts sorted and grouped by in that order, so we can use Power Automate's functionality to loop through those and group accounts and create those invoices correctly. So the next action is an apply to each action. This loops through all those services that we brought back from the list action. You'll see we have a couple of variables we're setting in here. These help us maintain which is our current account and which is an account from a previous record. This helps us determine when the account changes and we need to start a new invoice. So as we move ahead here, we want to get the Business Central account information. So this action at the top here, get account, that's getting our Dataverse account information that triggered this, that came in from the service. So the account the service is going to be charged to. The next one down is a set the variable for the account name that we can use later. And then the third one in light green there says get business account info. Now Business Central and Dynamics 365 for sales is using the out-of-the-box integration. So the account in Business Central has to be coupled with the account in D365 for sales. With that record and information there, that tells me that my account in CE or sales is linked to Business Central and what that Business Central unique ID is. So I go get that, and you'll see we branch below that. On the left side, we've successfully found a record. So we're able to set a variable to get things started and then create the header of the invoice. On the right side, this triggers if there is an error. So if we did not find that record, we actually want to set a variable with some information that we can use later to notify the accounting team that the account was not coupled and will need to be. So here we see we're going to create that invoice header in BC. A few things to note here is I had to work with a BC consultant to make sure I got the proper information to get this created correctly. This includes the environment, which is the production environment, the company name, the table name, which is very important because that's the sales invoices table, which is the header for the sale invoice. And then down further, we're setting the invoice date and the posting date. Now, since this runs monthly, we just set it to the current date that this runs. And then at the bottom, you'll see the customer number. This is the number that we pulled in from that coupled record to make sure we have the correct Business Central customer ID. Once we've created that header, we need to move forward and create the invoice line. So in order to do that, we need to get the product that is on that service record that we initially came from and pull in that product. Now here again, you see I kind of have a branching here again. Down the left side, if we did not find the product correctly, we need to set up that variable with information to notify accounting that the product was not set up correctly and needs attention. When we find the product, we go down the right side, we start that sequence variable, and we create the invoice line in Business Central. So here's our action for creating that Business Central invoice line. So here again, I worked with the Business Central consultant to get the proper information so it gets created correctly. And as you can see again, we have to specify the environment name, the company name, and the table name, sales invoice lines. We specify the document ID, which refers back to the original invoice header record, the sequence number, which we increment periodically since we have to have unique sequence numbers for each line within an invoice, and then the item. Now this we pull back from that product record to make sure we have the proper Business Central item unique ID. The line type is item, which is set within BC. We include a description of the service that came off that record. And then down below, you'll see the unit price of that service that was provided. And this quantity, we default to 1. Once we've created that invoice with those line items for that account in Business Central, we go back and we update the service tracking record in D365 for sales. You'll see that we got the table name of services, the row ID from the service from the initial trigger, and the invoice number that was created from the invoice header creation, and the line number from the invoice line that we created. This way, users are able to go back into sales, look at that service record, and note that it has been invoiced, what the invoice in Business Central is, and what the line number is. So if they need to do any research or troubleshooting, it gives them that valuable information to be able to move forward. And then to finish off, at the end, we update that display variable with more information indicating that it is done. And then we send that email off to the accounting team. This email contains information about successful creations of invoices and what services they were applied to. It also indicates any errors that we came upon. For instance, we didn't find that coupled account, or maybe the item for that service did not have the GUID that identifies the Business Central item. So then we can send that off to them monthly, and they can look at that and address anything they need to. And they also have history of what took place. In our next requirement, the sales manager needed to see monthly opportunity revenue splits based on project duration, so that they can better plan and forecast for the future. So a little background is this client does projects that span a length of time anywhere from 1 month to 2, maybe 3 years. And they want to be able to forecast out between that length of time what the estimated revenue will be. So what's involved here is the user creates the opportunity, sets the particular information, and then will trigger the process to create these revenue splits. The first thing that's done is it deletes the existing revenue splits. With this in place, it allows the user to make adjustments to the opportunity and recreate those cleanly. The next part is to format the estimated revenue. Now, another weakness in Power Automate is it has a float variable, but it does not allow us to specify decimal precision. So when using that, numbers do not get calculated correctly to, say, 2 decimal points or currency. After that, we get the number of months between those dates, and then we calculate the split amount using that number and check to see if there's a remainder. And then lastly, we'll create the opportunity revenue split records. So the first thing is it's triggered by the user. We have when the record is modified, and it's the opportunity. And the column is a custom column called calculate revenue splits. It's a yes or no field. So when it is true, they will trigger this Power Automate. Next, we list existing revenue split records that need to be deleted. We do this so we can make sure that every time we create these records, we have a clean list with updated numbers. So basically what we're doing here is we're doing a list action and checking for any revenue split records in the table that are equal to the opportunity that we're triggered from. And then we have the apply to each, which contains a delete action to delete those records. Next, you'll see here we need to format the estimated revenue. Now this gets into that float concept, and we need to convert these numbers to an integer. So as you can see, we're using an expression to get this value, and it's using the multiply or the mul function within Power Automate to multiply that value by 100.00. Now once we've done that, it's moved the decimal place 2 places to the right, And then the next action is to convert that to an integer. So now we have that number without decimal places, so that we can calculate it using that. It's kind of a nice little workaround that we discovered, and maybe someday they'll have another option besides float for decimal places in Power Automate. Once we've done that, we want to get the number of months between the dates. So we're using a do until here. Basically, we're going to start at the start date and go through to the end date and calculate how many months are in there. The first action within this is to add 1 month to the increment. This helps us to break out of this do until when it's completed. And then we set the running date based on that time action. And we increment the split count by 1, so we know how many records we're going to be creating. And then we increment the variable, and then we continue on to the next month. Once we have that, we want to calculate the monthly split and the remainder. Now here again, we have a variable that takes advantage of a function within Power Automate, the div function. So we're dividing the actual revenue by the number of months that we've calculated between those two dates. And once we have that, we also do a calculation for the remainder value, if there is any, using the mod function. Basically, it's almost identical, just mod instead of div. So that gives us any leftover amounts that we will add to the last entry. Then we move on to creating the revenue split records. This is done within a do until, and we do it for every count that we found for the number of months. So if we found there was 12 months between, the do until will loop through 12 times. If we found it was 18 months, it'll loop through 18 times. So the first thing we do is we set the time or the date that we want to create the record for. So we add 1 month to the interval. And then we set that variable into the running date, and then we increment our counter so we know when to exit the do until loop. And then within that loop next, we create that opportunity split record. We have a custom table called opportunity revenue splits. We set the name just to name. We don't really need that field. And we have the opportunity reference field, so it's referenced back to be linked to the opportunity that we're working with. And here again, at the actual amount of the split, you'll see we're using that function. We have a nested if, and we also do a float and a div function. We've nested these together, but you'll see the key is that we're dividing by 100.00. This is going to move us over 2 decimal places so we can get the cents of the dollar if there is any at that point. And then we set the running date that was calculated in the add time action. And then upon completion of that looping, we update the opportunity to indicate completion. So we just go back to the opportunity. We have the row ID from the opportunity that was triggered, and then we set the splits generated on custom field to the function UTC now. That pulls in the current UTC date and time, and Dynamics 365 for sales, once this is stored in there, it'll use the user's time and date settings for their time zone to show that correctly. And it also allows the user to know that it has been completed. Our next example from our real world examples, as a support manager, on Friday, I need to receive an email for each support person listing their current cases so I can manage the team's workload better. Now here we're going to again use the schedule or the reoccurrence action for this to trigger. We're initializing a variable, and this variable is going to contain HTML that we're going to generate on the fly. That'll be used later in the Power Automate. Then we're going to get open cases from the Dataverse and the case entity. We're going to order it by user. Again, as we noted earlier, the aggregate functionality is not supported. So we're going to use looping and if statements and various variables to make that aggregation work within Power Automate. And then we're going to add case data once that comes in to that variable in an HTML format so we can see it better in a PDF and an email as we send those later on. So we start out with the schedule. So this Power Automate is scheduled to run Friday of each week. You can see we have the interval of 1 for every Friday. Frequency is the week. Start time, that just tells us, when we want to start this to happen. We can actually schedule this to start 6 months out in the future, or any time really, or we can set a previous date to set it to run the next Friday that comes up. And you'll see it beyond these Fridays at these hours, which is 2 a.m. And then at the bottom, there's a preview that kind of gives you a verbal significance of when it will run. The next thing we do is we initialize that variable. Now, when you look at this, you'll see the value of this string is HTML. HTML comes in very handy here because it allows us to set styles. It allows us to format that email. In this case, we're creating a table. We're going to put some borders on it. And if you look down towards the bottom, you'll see that in this table we have columns for last name, first name, assigned date, who the owner is, the call-in status, and the primary state of the case. Next, we get the open cases from the Dataverse. So here again, we're doing a list records on cases, or call-ins in this case. And we're using fetch XML this time to query the data. And as you can see, we get the attributes we want within that fetch XML. We're checking the state codes to make sure we're getting the proper records we want. And we're also checking the call-in status to make sure that we get the correct status there also. So next, we append the string to that variable. Now, it's that variable we initialized earlier with HTML and table, the first part of the table definition. So here you can see the TRs are a row within the table. The TDs are columns within that row. So here you can see we're creating a last name, first name, that date, time, full name of the owner, and the two different statuses. So now we're starting to format that HTML or columns within that table as we move through the data. Once we have all those records formatted into that HTML with all the different columns and the rows specific to that user, we create a file in OneNote. Now, something to keep in mind here is you have to have access to OneNote and a license to use it for this to work. But we specify the folder path with the slash. That just tells us to put it in the root folder in OneDrive. The file name that we want it to call, here we said call and report.html, and the file content. And you'll see we reference that variable that contains all of that HTML with the embedded data in that. And then once that file's created, it returns an ID for that file. And the next OneDrive action we have is the convert file. And this allows us to take that ID of that file and convert it into a PDF. Once that is complete, we want to send that to the manager. So we use the Outlook send an email action. Now here again, you definitely need Outlook license. This uses Outlook Online to send the email. on behalf of who is running this Power Automate. The subject, we could call in, and the owner of that from the aggregation that we've done utilizing the Power Automate functionality. And then in the body, we attach that variable with the HTML in it. Now, what you're not seeing here is that we're also attaching the PDF as an attachment in this. So it comes over in two formats and allows the receiver to save the PDF however they want. And then at the end of this, we want to make sure we delete the files we created in OneDrive, because we don't want to get that loaded up with any excess. If we did not do that, over time, we would probably fill up the space that's available on OneDrive, and then we'd start seeing errors. So we do the delete to do a cleanup. So in our next Power Automate, we're going to look at a sales manager's need for accurate addresses with counties, so I can better align territories with salespeople. Now, this one is triggered when an address changes on the account. Once it does, we get the location for the address, we get a territory by county, and then we update the account with the county, the state, latitude, longitude, and finally the territory. So it's triggered when an add or modify takes place on the account, and the columns in the select columns we're specifically looking for changes in the address line 1, address 1 city, or address 1 postal code. Once those are changed and it triggers, we use the Bing Maps action to go out and get that address validation. Now, something to keep in mind here is that Bing Maps, you need a user key to supply this action, and that can be found at Bing Maps website. So here we're supplying that address information, we're calling Bing Maps, and it returns a JSON object with all that address information. JSON action here does not initially know how to parse that. So what we did initially is we put that JSON response from Bing into a variable, copied the results, and clicked the generate from sample button, as you see there, and pasted that in. Now that parsing knows the labels and the values that go with each one. And then on the right side, you'll see we're setting a variable for the county, and it's called admin district 2 when it comes back from Bing. So it's something, it took a little time to figure out where these fields were coming from because the names are different. But we're able to grab the county, the longitude, latitude, and so on. So once we had that information, we have a county custom record or entity for the client. This specifies the state and the county and the territory that's associated with that, and that's managed by the users or the client. So we go do a lookup to that county, and you can see in the filter rows, we're using JSON notation there to make sure that's an active record, that the state is equal to the admin district that came back from the Bing Maps, and the name is equal to the county that came back from Bing Maps. Now we know that's going to return one record, but we still have to do an apply to each because it's a list records action above. Once we have that, then we can set the variable for the territory that came back with that record. Now that we have that information, we can go back and update the account that originally triggered this Power Automate. So you see the table name is accounts, the row ID comes from the trigger itself for the account GUID. We set the state or province in address 1 from the JSON response. We take this time to format the country to USA. They only work in the USA at this time, so we got approval to set that there. we set the county, we set the latitude, we set the longitude, and then we set the territory on that account. So then it's assigned to the correct salesperson. And the latitude and longitude will be used down the road in Bing Maps and Google Maps to identify the location of the account, so they can use that for mapping out directions, coordinates, and maybe even doing points on a map to see where other accounts are. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining me in the 4 different real-world user requirements that we solved with Power Automate. I hope I was able to provide you with some good information with real examples, and that you gained more knowledge of Power Automate in ways that you can use to solve requirements that you have. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for voting for this session and giving me the opportunity to present. I will be around a little bit longer to address any questions you may have. Thank you. Hello everybody, Herb Johnson here, following up on my session today. I want to thank you for attending, and I want to thank you for voting to have my session on DynamicsCon today. So I was looking through and I didn't see any questions come through, but I do have questions that have come into me various times related to developing a Power Automate. One of the top questions I get is, how do you approach creating a Power Automate? Where do I start? What do I do? And a few things I do is I'll start out with a notepad or Word document, and I'll just go through and make notes, set up some sort of hierarchy of what I want to do and what actions I want to take within the Power Automate itself. Sometimes I'll even use a Visio document and create a flow chart. That tends to be very helpful to get the full overview of what's needed, so I can keep going with that. And then I build the Power Automate in small portions and test regularly. That way I can find a way to solve my problems if I run into errors and I'm not having a large Power Automate to kind of dig through and sift through to figure that out. Next thing I do is I always save on a regular basis. There's no auto save at this point within Power Automate, so it's a good practice to save strategically intervals, just to in case the internet goes down or maybe something else happens and you need to get your work back, so you don't want to have to recreate anything else. Another thing I'd like to recommend too is when you're setting up a Power Automate, if it's going to be running daily, monthly, or something on a regular basis that's not run by a specific user, I recommend you set up a service account. That way it's run as that service. You don't have to worry about users leaving the organizations that may have access to it or may be running as. That way you can keep it going on a regular basis and don't have to worry about interruptions or failures and then trying to get caught up and figure that out. Another couple of tips I have, you noticed in the filter actions, there was the JSON notation for the filters. One thing that comes in really handy for me is I'm not a big JSON fan. I don't know a lot about it, but with the use of the XRM toolbox and the Fetch XML builder within that tool, you can view the JSON notation that relates to that Fetch XML. It actually does a nice little conversion. You can copy and paste that and put it right into that filter within the list actions in the Power Automate. So with that in mind, also, then you can also use that JSON notation in other areas too throughout Power Automate. It's pretty handy there. Also, another thing I recommend is always go through and explore in Power Automate the actions, search through them, see what's available. There's a lot of different groups throughout. There's the basic ones: SharePoint, Outlook, Dataverse, various controls and that sort of thing. But there's more being added all the time. So I recommend you just go back in there, you just look around, you share, you explore, play around, create test power automates, tinker with that, enjoy and have fun. And then my last question I have here is, what am I working on today? The current Power Automate I'm working with has to do with when a record is created, we wanted to send out an email related to the customer, sending them some basic documents that we want them to have on hand and review and be aware of. So we're pulling those documents out of SharePoint. We're going to add them into an email that'll be sent out, and the email is going to be associated with that customer and also with the owner of the record or the salesperson, so that they're able to follow up and keep track of that. So that's all I have for now. If there's any other questions, I'm watching the queue to see if there is any. But once again, thank you for participating today and joining me in this session. Alrighty, as there is no more at this time, once again, thanks again for voting me in, and have a great day. Goodbye.